November 12, 1983, and Interstate 80 stretched across Nebraska's flat landscape, a ribbon of asphalt connecting Omaha to the western part of the state, traveled by thousands of vehicles daily, including families making long-distance trips. The Keller family was driving from their home in Iowa to visit relatives in Denver for Thanksgiving, a 12-hour journey they'd made annually, and they'd left at 6 a.m. hoping to arrive by evening. Noah Keller was 5 years old that Saturday morning, a small boy with straight sandy blonde hair, brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses he'd gotten just 2 months earlier, and a serious demeanor unusual for his age. He wore brown corduroys, a cream-colored cable-knit sweater his grandmother had made, navy blue snow boots, and he clutched a hardcover book about trains that he'd been reading repeatedly during the drive. Noah was traveling with his parents, David and Rebecca Keller, and his older brother Ethan, who was 9, and the family had been on the road for approximately 4 hours when the incident occurred. At 10:15 a.m., their burgundy 1981 Buick Century station wagon had a tire blowout on I-80 near the small town of North Platte, and David carefully maneuvered the vehicle onto the highway shoulder about 50 yards from the nearest mile marker. The shoulder was wide and relatively flat, with open prairie stretching in all directions under gray November skies, and light snow had begun falling, creating poor visibility and slick road conditions. David got out to assess the damage while Rebecca stayed in the car with the boys, and he determined they had a spare tire, but would need to unload luggage from the back to access the jack and tools. "Boys, come help me move some bags," David called at approximately 10:20 a.m., and both Ethan and Noah climbed out of the station wagon, eager to stretch their legs after hours of sitting. The family worked together, moving suitcases from the cargo area to the ground beside the vehicle, and Noah was carrying his small overnight bag when he noticed something in the prairie grass about 15 yards from the highway. "Dad, there's a dog out there," Noah said, pointing toward what appeared to be a medium-sized animal moving through the tall grass parallel to the highway shoulder. David glanced up briefly and saw movement in the grass, possibly a stray dog or coyote, and he told Noah to stay away from it and focus on helping with the luggage. But Noah, who loved animals and had been begging his parents for a dog, was transfixed by the animal and began walking slowly toward it, still holding his overnight bag and his book about trains. "Noah, get back here, don't go near that animal," Rebecca called from beside the car, but Noah had already walked about 10 yards into the grass, moving slowly and calling softly to the dog. David and Rebecca were both focused on organizing luggage and preparing to change the tire, and Ethan was inside the car reading, and for approximately 30 to 40 seconds, nobody was watching Noah closely. When Rebecca looked up expecting to see Noah near the grass calling to the dog, he was no longer visible anywhere in the immediate area, and the animal he'd been following had also disappeared. "Noah!" Rebecca called, and when there was no response, both parents immediately stopped what they were doing and ran toward the area where they'd last seen him, calling his name into the prairie wind. The tall grass made visibility difficult, and the light snow was accumulating enough to obscure footprints, and within seconds both parents were frantically searching the area around the highway, calling Noah's name. In approximately 30 to 40 seconds, while his family changed a tire on I-80 in Nebraska, 5-year-old Noah Keller vanished into prairie grass after following what he'd thought was a stray dog. If you want to hear how this little boy was finally found 4 decades later in shocking circumstances, make sure you're subscribed, hit that like button, and comment where you're watching from. Now let's continue. By 10:25 a.m., David and Rebecca had searched a 100-yard radius from the highway without finding any trace of Noah, and they were screaming his name while Ethan stood by the car crying and confused. David flagged down a passing truck driver who stopped to help, and the driver used his CB radio to contact Nebraska State Police, reporting a missing child on I-80 near North Platte mile marker 177. Nebraska State Patrol arrived at 10:40 a.m., and Trooper Michael Santos immediately organized a search of the area while calling for additional units and search and rescue resources. The prairie stretched endlessly in all directions with minimal landmarks, and the falling snow was creating conditions that could quickly become dangerous for a 5-year-old in a sweater and boots. Rebecca was hysterical, explaining that Noah had walked toward a dog in the grass and had simply disappeared, and she couldn't understand how he could be gone when they'd only looked away for seconds. By 11 a.m., over 20 law enforcement officers were searching the prairie around mile marker 177, walking in grid patterns through grass that was now covered with 2 inches of fresh snow obscuring any tracks Noah might have left. Search and rescue teams arrived from North Platte with bloodhounds, and the dogs were given Noah's scent from clothing in the station wagon. But the falling snow and wind were making tracking extremely difficult. The dogs picked up a trail leading from the highway shoulder into the prairie, but after approximately 50 yards, the scent became confused, and the handlers reported the dogs were circling without establishing a clear direction. Trooper Santos interviewed David and Rebecca extensively about exactly what they'd seen and the timeline of Noah's disappearance, and both parents insisted their son had walked toward what appeared to be a dog in the grass. "It looked like a medium-sized brown dog," David explained, "just wandering through the prairie, and Noah loves animals, so he went toward it calling to it, and when we looked up seconds later he was gone." The theory emerged that what the family had seen wasn't a dog at all, but possibly someone on hands and knees in the grass, deliberately luring Noah away from his family while they were distracted with the tire change. This theory was supported by the fact that no dog or coyote had been found in the area despite extensive searching, and it seemed unlikely a real animal would have simply vanished in the same time frame as Noah. Law enforcement examined the highway shoulder near where the Kellers had stopped, and they found tire tracks in the mud and snow suggesting another vehicle had been parked there recently, possibly before the Kellers arrived. The tracks indicated a larger vehicle, possibly a van or truck, and they led from the shoulder back onto the highway heading west. But without witnesses or cameras, there was no way to identify the specific vehicle. FBI was contacted by noon given the potential for kidnapping and interstate trafficking, and Special Agent Catherine Wells arrived from the Omaha field office with resources and experience from similar cases. Agent Wells theorized that someone had been waiting on the highway shoulder, had seen the Keller's tire blow out and stop nearby, and had used the opportunity to lure Noah away while the family was distracted. The person might have used an actual dog initially to attract Noah's attention, then grabbed him once he was far enough from the highway that his parents couldn't see, and quickly transported him to a waiting vehicle. But this theory required extraordinary luck or planning, because the perpetrator couldn't have known the Kellers would have a tire blowout at that specific location unless the blowout had been deliberately caused. Examination of the blown tire revealed it had hit road debris, likely a piece of metal that had punctured the sidewall, and there was no evidence the blowout had been sabotaged or deliberately arranged. By Sunday, the search had expanded to cover a 5-mile radius from the abduction site, with helicopters scanning the prairie and ground teams checking abandoned buildings and farm structures where a child might have been taken. The case generated intense media coverage across Nebraska and neighboring states, with Noah's photo appearing on television showing his wire-rimmed glasses and serious expression, clutching his book about trains. Tips flooded in from people claiming to have seen Noah or suspicious vehicles on I-80, but every reported sighting was investigated and found to be other children or vehicles unconnected to the case. One witness reported seeing a white conversion van with dark-tinted windows on I-80, heading west around 10:30 a.m. Saturday, traveling faster than the snowy conditions warranted, but couldn't provide a license plate or more specific details. This description of a white van became the investigation's primary lead, and law enforcement issued alerts for such vehicles. But thousands of white vans traveled Nebraska highways, and narrowing down one specific vehicle proved impossible. By late November, the intensive daily search operations had been scaled back after 2 weeks in increasingly harsh weather conditions, produced no trace of Noah despite thousands of volunteer hours. David and Rebecca were devastated, unable to understand how their son had vanished in seconds while they stood 50 yards away changing a tire on a highway traveled by hundreds of vehicles. The cream-colored sweater and navy boots Noah had been wearing became iconic elements of the case, and for years people reported seeing children in similar clothing, though none of these sightings led to finding Noah. The book about trains Noah had been carrying was never found, presumably taken with him or discarded by whoever had abducted him from that prairie grass. The case was featured on America's Most Wanted in 1984, and the broadcast generated thousands of tips including multiple reports about white conversion vans, but investigation revealed none were connected to Noah's disappearance. The years passed with unbearable slowness for the Keller family, with 1983 becoming 1990 and then 2000, and Noah's bedroom remained exactly as it had been, filled with books about trains and animals that a 5-year-old had loved. David and Rebecca's marriage survived, though it was forever scarred by guilt and grief, both parents replaying those 40 seconds on the highway shoulder, and wondering what they could have done differently to prevent Noah from walking into the grass. Ethan grew up defined by the loss of his younger brother, and he became a search and rescue volunteer as an adult, dedicating himself to finding other missing people in hopes of giving families the closure his own had never received. Age progression photos were created showing what Noah might look like at 10, 15, 25, 35, and these images were distributed through missing persons databases as decades passed without answers. Detective James Morrison took over the cold case in 2010, and he was struck by the unusual circumstances of a child being taken from a highway shoulder in broad daylight with family members just yards away. Morrison investigated whether the tire blowout had truly been accidental, or if someone had deliberately scattered road debris to cause vehicles to stop at that specific location, creating opportunities for abductions. But examination of I-80 maintenance records and accident reports showed no pattern of suspicious tire blowouts in that area, suggesting the Keller's incident had been genuinely accidental rather than orchestrated. By 2020, Noah would have been 42 years old, and David and Rebecca, now in their 70s, held memorial services each November 12th near mile marker 177 where they'd lost their son. They'd erected a small roadside memorial with Noah's photo and a plaque reading, "Noah Keller, age 5, vanished here 11/12/1983, forever loved, never forgotten," and passing motorists would occasionally stop to leave flowers. True crime podcasts discovered Noah's case in the early 2020s, and several shows featured detailed episodes about the roadside abduction and the mysterious dog that had lured a 5-year-old to his disappearance. Some podcasters theorized that a predator had been traveling I-80 looking for vulnerable targets, and when the Kellers stopped with the tire blowout, they'd used an animal or decoy to lure Noah away during the brief window when his parents were distracted. In August 2024, a man named Daniel Wright, living in Montana, contacted a genealogist after taking a DNA test and discovering he had close genetic matches to people he'd never heard of in Iowa. Daniel, age 46 and working as a wilderness guide in Missoula, had been raised by his grandfather Walter Wright, who died in 2020, and he'd always believed his parents had died in a car accident when he was very young. "My grandfather said my parents died when I was 5, and he took me in and raised me in Montana," Daniel explained to genealogist Maria Santos, "but I never saw death certificates or had any documentation, and it always felt like there were gaps in the story." The DNA test results showed Daniel had close genetic matches to David and Rebecca Keller in Iowa, and the connection was consistent with being their biological son, which made no sense given what Daniel had been told. Maria immediately contacted Nebraska State Police, and Detective Sarah Chen from the Cold Case Unit began comparing Daniel Wright's DNA against Noah Keller's profile that had been in databases for decades. The DNA analysis took 10 weeks, and when results came back in November 2024, exactly 41 years after Noah's disappearance, they showed a 99.96% probability that Daniel Wright was Noah Keller. The confirmation sent shockwaves through the cold case community and made international headlines. Noah Keller had been found alive at age 46, living in Montana under the name Daniel Wright. Detective Chen's investigation revealed that Walter Wright had been traveling west on I-80 on November 12, 1983, and had stopped on the highway shoulder near mile marker 177, possibly for a rest or to check his vehicle. Walter had apparently been positioned in the prairie grass when the Kellers had their tire blowout nearby, and he'd seized the opportunity presented by the distracted family and wandering child. Former neighbors who'd known Walter in Montana were interviewed, and several recalled that he'd suddenly appeared in Missoula in late 1983, with a young grandson he claimed to be raising after his daughter's death. Walter was in his late 50s then, and he said his daughter and son-in-law died in an accident, so he was taking care of little Daniel. One neighbor remembered, "We never questioned it because Walter seemed like a decent man." Walter had been a retired railroad worker, which explained why he'd given Daniel books about trains and encouraged his interest in them, though Daniel now realized this had been manipulation based on what Noah had been carrying when taken. Detective Chen's investigation revealed that Walter Wright had no biological grandchildren, and his only daughter had died from leukemia in 1979 at age 32, 4 years before Noah's abduction. Walter had apparently never recovered from losing his daughter, and according to psychiatric records Chen discovered, he'd become obsessed with the idea of having family again and raising a grandchild he'd been denied. Former co-workers from the railroad where Walter had worked until retirement in 1982 were interviewed, and several mentioned that he'd become increasingly withdrawn after his daughter's death, talking about how unfair life had been. Walter said he deserved another chance, one former colleague recalled. He talked about how good he would have been as a grandfather if his daughter had lived long enough to have children, and we thought he was just grieving. Chen theorized that Walter had been traveling I-80 on November 12, 1983, possibly heading to Denver or further west, when he'd stopped on the shoulder for reasons unknown. When the Kellers had their tire blow out and stopped nearby, Walter had seen an opportunity, and he'd positioned himself in the prairie grass, possibly with a dog he'd had in his vehicle, deliberately attracting Noah's attention. Once Noah had walked far enough from the highway that his parents couldn't see through the tall grass and falling snow, Walter had grabbed him, covered his mouth to prevent screaming, and quickly carried him to his vehicle. Walter's vehicle records from 1983 showed he'd owned a white 1979 Ford Econoline van, matching the description of the vehicle a witness had reported seeing on I-80 heading west around the time of Noah's disappearance. Walter had driven immediately to Montana with Noah, a 12-hour journey that would have gotten them to Missoula by late evening, far from Nebraska before any roadblocks or alerts could be effective. Over the following weeks and months, Walter had convinced 5-year-old Noah that his parents had died in a car accident, that he was Walter's grandson Daniel, and that his previous memories were dreams or confusion from trauma. He told me I'd been in the car accident too. That's why I didn't remember things clearly, Daniel told investigators. And I was 5 years old, so I believed him because he was the only adult in my life and seemed to care about me. Walter had homeschooled Daniel initially to avoid questions about his background and lack of proper documentation, and by the time Daniel entered public school at age 10, he'd fully accepted his identity as Daniel Wright. The wire-rimmed glasses Noah had been wearing were replaced by Walter within days of the abduction, eliminating one of the most distinctive identifying features that might have caused someone to recognize the missing child. Walter had obtained fraudulent documents for Daniel using connections from his railroad work, creating a birth certificate and social security number that allowed the child to navigate society without raising suspicions. Daniel struggled with the revelation that Walter Wright, the grandfather who'd raised him for 35 years, had been his kidnapper, and that everything he'd believed about his origins was a lie constructed to hide a crime. Walter taught me to fish, helped me with homework, came to every school event. He was my grandfather in every way except biologically, Daniel said through tears. But he also stole me from my real parents and kept me from them for 41 years. The meeting between Daniel and his biological family was arranged for December 2024, with therapists present to help navigate the complex emotions of a reunion after more than 4 decades. David and Rebecca, now 77 and 75, were overwhelmed when they saw Daniel for the first time, recognizing elements of the 5-year-old Noah in the 46-year-old man standing before them. "You have your mother's eyes," David said through tears. "And you still have that serious expression you had as a little boy, like you were always thinking about something important." Ethan met his brother for the first time since 1983, and while they were essentially strangers, they shared biological connection and the trauma of a childhood torn apart on a Nebraska highway. Daniel was shown photos and videos of himself as Noah before the abduction, seeing the cream sweater and wire-rimmed glasses, and he felt fragments of memory stirring, though most of his early childhood remained inaccessible. "I have these vague impressions of a different place, different people, a car trip," Daniel explained. But Walter always said those were dreams from the accident trauma, and I believed him because I had no reason not to. The book about trains Noah had been carrying was never found, but Daniel had grown up with an inexplicable fascination with trains that Walter had encouraged, and he now realized this had been manipulation based on what his 5-year-old self had loved. Daniel chose to legally become Daniel Noah Wright Keller in January 2025, honoring both the life he'd built for 41 years and the identity stolen from him at age 5 on a Nebraska highway. He traveled to Iowa to visit the home where he'd lived as Noah for the first 5 years of his life, standing in the bedroom that had been preserved for decades, surrounded by train books and toys chosen for a child who'd never returned. "This was my room," Daniel said quietly, touching the books on shelves. "I don't remember it consciously, but being here feels significant, like some part of me recognizes this place even if my mind can't access the memories." David and Rebecca showed Daniel photo albums and home videos from his early childhood. and watching himself as Noah triggered emotional responses, even when clear memories remained elusive. The video of Noah's 5th birthday party 2 months before the abduction was particularly painful, showing a serious little boy in wire-rimmed glasses, carefully examining presents while other children played loudly around him. "You were always quiet and thoughtful," Rebecca told Daniel. "Even as a toddler you preferred books to toys and you could focus on things for hours. We used to joke that you were an old soul in a little body." Ethan and Daniel worked to build a sibling relationship despite being strangers, and they found common ground in their shared experience of trauma and in outdoor activities that Daniel's wilderness guide work had made second nature. The case brought international attention to roadside abductions and the vulnerability of families during vehicle emergencies when attention is divided and children can wander away in seconds. Nebraska passed legislation in 2025 requiring enhanced emergency call boxes along I-80 with direct connections to State Patrol and mandating that motorists with disabled vehicles wait inside locked cars until help arrives. Noah's law also required that rest stops and emergency pull-off areas have surveillance cameras, creating documentation that could help solve cases if abductions occurred in these locations. Daniel established a foundation supporting adults who discover they were kidnapped as children, providing resources for DNA testing, therapy, legal assistance, and help navigating the complex process of integrating 2 identities. Within its first year, the foundation facilitated 8 identifications of long-term missing persons, proving that DNA databases were revealing numerous cases of children taken decades earlier and raised under false identities. The memorial at mile marker 177 where Noah had vanished was expanded to include information about the case's resolution and to honor David and Rebecca's 41 years of searching. The updated plaque reads, "Noah Keller, taken 1983, found alive 2024, a testament to a parent's love and the power of DNA technology, transforming the site from a place of grief to one of hope." Daniel's wife and 2 teenage sons were supportive, though they struggled to process the revelation that their husband and father had been a missing child from Iowa with an entire family they'd never known about. "It's surreal," Daniel's wife told reporters. "The man I married thought he was Daniel Wright, orphaned grandson of a railroad worker, and now he's Noah Keller, stolen from a highway during a tire change." Daniel's sons met their biological grandparents and uncle for the first time, and David and Rebecca were overwhelmed with gratitude to finally know their son and meet the family he'd built. "We missed everything," Rebecca said through tears. "His first day of school, graduation, wedding, the births of these beautiful grandsons, 41 years of memories we can never get back, but we're grateful for whatever time we have now." The case proved that DNA technology combined with genealogical databases was solving cases once thought impossible, and that adults should investigate their backgrounds if anything about their early childhood seemed unclear. It demonstrated that children can be taken in seconds from locations that seem safe, and that predators can create false identities sophisticated enough to pass scrutiny for decades. And it showed that even when the perpetrator dies before being held accountable, as Walter Wright had in 2020, finding the truth still matters for the families and the missing person who deserves to know their real identity. Daniel wrote a memoir about discovering at age 46 that he was Noah Keller, and the book became a bestseller, inspiring other adults to investigate questionable origin stories and gaps in their early childhood documentation. His story led to 12 additional cases being solved in 2025 and 2026, as people who'd wondered about their backgrounds submitted DNA and discovered they were missing children reported decades earlier. David and Rebecca lived to see their son found and to meet their grandchildren, a miracle they'd prayed for through 41 years of not knowing, and they considered it a gift beyond measure. The cream-colored cable-knit sweater Noah had worn became a symbol of the case, and Rebecca had kept it preserved for 41 years, eventually giving it to Daniel as a tangible connection to the 5-year-old he'd been. Daniel keeps the sweater in a shadow box in his Montana home alongside the memorial plaque from I-80, visual reminders of where his journey began and the family that never stopped searching. The story of Noah Keller, taken at age 5 from a Nebraska highway and found 41 years later as Daniel Wright through DNA technology, stands as one of the most remarkable missing persons cases ever resolved. It reminds us that 5-year-olds should be safe during roadside emergencies, that 40 seconds of distraction is all an abductor needs, and that DNA can reunite families even after 4 decades. And on I-80 in Nebraska, where a little boy in wire-rimmed glasses once walked into prairie grass following what he thought was a dog, his story lives on as proof that stolen children can be found and brought home. Daniel continues his wilderness guide work in Montana while maintaining close relationships with his Iowa family, traveling quarterly to visit and building memories with the parents and brother he lost at age 5. He told reporters that learning he was Noah Keller was both devastating and liberating, destroying the identity he'd known while giving him back a family and history he'd been denied for 41 years. "Walter Wright stole my childhood and my family," Daniel said. "But he couldn't steal my future, and now I have both lives integrated. The one I built as Daniel, and the one I was born into as Noah."